Well, okay, so let's begin. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you today Ariel Azar. Ariel is an assistant professor of sociology and a faculty associate at the Center on Aging and the Life course at Purdue University. Ariel holds a PhD and MA in sociology from the University of Chicago, and a BA and MA in sociology from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He's also a visiting scholar at the Population Research Institute at Penn State. Ariel broad areas of interest relate to the sociology of health, the life course, political sociology, immigration, gender and sexuality, and quantitative research methods. He is particularly interested in how institutional arrangements, including state policies, shape health inequalities throughout the life course. He explores variation in individual contexts across cohorts and states, and how they affect health at different life course stages and how they vary across contexts. Ariel is extending this line of research to investigate how specific contexts and institutional configurations shape the health of immigrants and LGBT people. He is working on a project examining differences in LGBT-related health disparities between the US and England. So without further ado, it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Ariel Azar.
We're trying to solve a little technical difficulty. Give me 1 second. We'll get that figured out. But yeah, so I can start briefly talking about what I will be presenting today. So to be fully transparent, when Don asked me the title of my
You might not need it.
yeah. Okay, so to be fully transparent, when Don asked me the title of my talk, I sent her a title that wasn't the one I was intended to present originally. So what I did was that I will be talking about what I sent originally, and but I will be talking broadly about sort of a life course institutional model to understand health disparities, and I will show you briefly how that that framework sort of relates to 2 papers I've been working on that are currently being revised. One is the one on decriminalization policies and women's mental health in Europe, and the other one focuses on Latin American immigrants in the United States. So let me.
For the moment, your notes will appear that way until we can work on resolving that.
Yeah, I cannot control them.
So how do we unless screen
I'll start sharing this for you.
share? So share it. So just make it-
Anyway, so generally I'll be talking about this institutional and life course framework for the study of health inequalities, to then move forward to this paper on European women's mental health and decriminalization policies, which is the one of the title of the talk today. And then I will move to a Latin American immigrants health paper asking how does the country of origin matter for health? Again, implementing this theoretical framework I'm trying to develop, and then I will give you some final thoughts on a research agenda, the research agenda I'm trying to develop that Emilio briefly mentioned. So let's start by sort of developing this institutional life course framework for the study of health inequalities. So I think a graphical representation might be useful here to try to understand how I'm thinking through this line of thought. So imagine this square right here is a country, or it can be a state, or any polity or administrative division. And imagine each one of these lines representing the life course of a person. So we have a person that's born around 1960, and then they die around 1985, and then we have people who are born in different points in time and people who die, et cetera, et cetera. And imagine the colors in the background representing institutional arrangements of this country, right? Whatever that institutional arrangement is. So here we have another country where people also are born and also die, and also live through institutional arrangements throughout their lives. And institutional arrangements in the background tend to change with time, right? I argue that most of the research trying to understand how institutional arrangements, whether that's policy or political environments, shape individuals' health, tend to use a research design like the one I tried to illustrate here. So they use a cross-section of observations across 2 different countries, for example, and they show how the color in the background, the institutional arrangement, sort of matters to understand how health inequalities are observed across different groups in this context. However, I argue that we need to move towards understanding how institutional contexts are experienced throughout the life course in order to understand those inequalities, and not only how they're experienced at one point in time, right? Because we experience those points in time can be people who are living at different ages of different stages of their life course, and therefore they're experiencing, they have experienced different changes throughout time. And what makes things even more complicated is that countries are also composed by immigrants. So we have a population that is born in one country, and then moves to another country and is exposed to a different institutional arrangement, right? Or like I try to represent here, people born in country B and then who die in country A, right? So I think we need to use a comparative framework as a vital step in order to understand how policy contexts matter for health for 2 main reasons. So first of all, we need to put what sort of social epidemiology calls risk factors in context. In order to understand how a characteristic of our individual level characteristic or sort of a risk factor matters for health, we need to understand how that risk factor operates in different contexts to truly be able to understand how that relationship plays out, right? Because we also know that, for example, race matters differently in different contexts for health. And also, I think most of the research that does not look at sort of policy context from a life course perspective assumes that institutional exposure is not a cumulative process that occurs throughout the life course, right? It assumes that it's a process that's cross-sectional and just occurs at one point in time. So we need to look to move towards understanding institutional exposure as cumulative and critical at specific periods of the life course, right? So let's move on. Let's jump into the first empirical piece I wanted to talk to you about today. So, in this piece, what I tried to do is to understand European women's mental health and how life course trajectories in the work and health domain, work and family domain, relate to women's mental health, but also how that process is moderated by life course exposure to defamiliarization policies, right? Sort of using this institutional framework I was just talking to you about. So we know from the literature that work engagement and family life matter for mental health. We know that, for example, being attached to the labor force long-term or being out of the labor force has implications for mental health. Some are beneficial, some are negative. We also know that the configurations of family life and life transitions in family also matter for mental health. As for example, disruptions like divorce or widowhood have beneficial or negative effects on mental health. And I focus particularly on women because it's a group that's particularly affected by these changes in a context of life course differentiation. And by life course differentiation, I mean a context that motivated by sort of the second demographic transition and also changes from materialistic to post-materialistic values. We move to a context where life courses tend to be significantly more diverse in a specific population, and at the same time, people tend to experience way more transitions throughout their lives. So life courses become more unstable, and therefore, we need to not only explore sort of the association of, let's say, being employed over mental health, but we also need to understand how those transitions throughout life matter for mental health. The same with family life dynamics. As you saw earlier, my research argues that we need to put these relationships in context, right? And we know from the literature that focuses on welfare states mostly that welfare states or policy arrangements matter. Most of this research, for a diverse series of reasons, has focused mostly in Europe, and has mostly derived from looking at how certain characteristics of welfare states, as observed by mostly like Sping-Anderson onwards, associate to the distribution of health in a specific population. So, as I said, we need to put this relationship in context. However, I don't think it's useful to put the relationship in context using very broad typologies of welfare states. We need to focus on specific policy areas or policy dimensions to be able to understand how these different policy dimensions matter for the distribution of health, or how characteristics of people's life courses affect the distribution of health. So, in this paper in particular, I focus at the institutional level on defamiliation policies. And defamiliation policies are just policies that tend to take away the burden from women in terms of family care, and then they tend to create incentives or opportunities for women to join the labor market, taking away, again, that burden from family work and care, right? And defamiliation is a concept that has been sort of pushed through welfare states and gender scholars, but it's also a concept that it's rooted in like the very early tradition of welfare states literature coming from Sping-Anderson onwards. So with all this in mind, in this paper, I asked, how does defamiliation influence the impact of work on life courses on mental health? So what I'm doing here is trying to understand how the exposure, the life course exposure, and I'll get into how I measure this, how the life course exposure to defamiliation policies shapes the relationship between life course in the work and family domain and mental health. And as background theories of what one could expect is going on here, one could sort of cite cumulative advantages or disadvantages. Life course theories will also sort of role enhancement or role conflict theories that sort of would argue that certain roles in the labor market and in the family domain, when occurring, might affect mental health, etc. But basically, what I try to do then is to understand how defamiliation policies impact work family life courses on mental health, the relationship between those two things. So to do this, I use share and shared life data. For those of you who are not familiar with this data, the share is the Serving for Health and Retirement in Europe, I believe. And basically, the information I use from this survey is country of birth, the life trajectories, and the mental health outcomes. And I also use Shared Life, which is a module of Share that collects retrospective data on several domains, including family and work. So the analytical sample coming from this data is European woman born between 1924 and 1965 across 14 European countries or 15 territories, given that Germany is split between West and East Germany because of its history. And every individual included in the sample is age 50 or above at the time of the interview. So here's a little graphical representation of the structure of the data. This is just a Lexis diagram that shows that individuals were observed during share lives wave 3 and 7, which are shares wave 3 and 7, sorry, for which you collect retrospective data for all their whole lives in different dimensions. And I focus on life histories built during this period, and all health outcomes are measured after age 50 and above, from collecting data from the different waves of share, if that makes sense. And at the country level, I use data developed by Zagel and Van Winkel in a really interesting paper looking at how defamiliation and familialization policies sort of shape life courses in Europe and their complexity. And I use country year data between 1924 and 2006, using the defamiliation index that I'll get into it later, and also just as a sort of country year level control GDP per capita as measuring, trying to capture economic development. So my main outcome of interest is, of course, mental health, and I measured it using the EuroD construct that uses 12 indicators of how people have felt in the last I believe it's 4 weeks, I'm not fully sure right now. But basically, I built the URD indicator that has been sort of used in the literature significantly. It measures suppressive symptomatology, and based on research using clinical settings data, I use a threshold of above 3 to create a binary variable showing that individuals are either depressed or not. Okay, so the outcome is a binary variable. For work and family trajectories, and I'll get into how these are built in a second, but I just, people, when collecting retrospective data, people self-reported what they were doing during specific points in time during their lives. So basically what I do is that I build a pseudo panel data with individual years. So individuals get observed between their birth and the time of interview. And these are the different dimensions observed for the work and family domains. And the family domain, sorry, these are the opposite. The family domain has both with children and without children. So it's 12 states. And regarding defamiliation, the defamiliation index, I create an index of average exposure to defamiliation policies between ages 15 and 40. So basically, and this is the simplest way. I can get into during the Q&A into other ways I tried measuring this, but it's just an arithmetic mean between ages 15 and 40 of people's indices during the country years to which they're exposed, and that index is built using this six policy indicators. So availability of public early childcare, availability of public preschool childcare, existence of old age social pension, standardized duration of paid maternity leave, number of weeks of job protected maternal leave, and number of weeks of paid maternal leave. So using all this six indicators, and this is again something I didn't build, but basically what the authors do is take these variables and just do a factor analysis to create this defamiliation index. So to build the trajectory, so I have pseudo panel data for individuals observed every year since birth to the time of observation, right? So what I do in order to be able to understand how this life trajectories deploy throughout life between ages 15 and 50, I use sequence analysis, sequence and cluster analysis. So for those of you who are not familiar with this methodology, it's just a methodology that allows comparing longitudinal data where you have categorical data for each observation, for each point in time, and it allows you to compare those trajectories based on the cost that it takes to convert the trajectory of one person into another. And with that, one builds a distance matrix, just like you do in any cluster analysis, and then you just conduct a cluster analysis to understand how the life trajectories are close or distant from each other to create these clusters. So this, what I'm displaying here, is called a chronogram or distribution plot of multi-channel trajectory types. And this is multi-channel because I use both dimensions simultaneously in the analysis, which basically means that all possible states get multiplied between each other. So women can be either employed and married with children, or employed and cohabitated without children, et cetera, et cetera. So you get, in this case, 12 times 5 states, 60 possible states, 12 times 7 states possible in this trajectories throughout time. So this distribution plot, what it shows, and this is just one of the outcomes, the possible outcomes of sequence analysis, it shows the percentage, after doing the cluster analysis, the percentage of women within each cluster experiencing each one of the employment statuses or the family statuses at each point in time. So this goes from age 15 to 50, and the y-axis just go from 0 to 1. This is just a proportion of women experiencing each state. So the cluster analysis revealed six clusters of women with different characteristics each, of course. So the first cluster, careerists, which these names are just arbitrary, they could be called something different. But the first one, careerist, late union, is just women that tend to be, so the light blue is employed, so they tend to be, they tend to have a long-term attachment to the labor market, but they also get married relatively late and have children relatively late, right? Unlike the all other groups, which I'll get into right now. Then we have the sort of classical homemaker archetype, and this is just women who tend to be doing home or family work most of their lives. So a few number of them tends to have a labor force attachment at the beginning, but then they tend to do home and family work, and they tend to marry at very normative ages, so around 23, at very normative ages, and they just stay married with children throughout their trajectories. And this represents around 30% of the sample. Then we have the, which I call the entrepreneur families. I'm not fully convinced by this name, but it's basically women who are self-employed throughout most of their trajectory, and then they tend to also get married and have children at relatively normative ages and just stay married throughout their trajectory, most of them. Then we have a group, I'm sorry, this represents around 7.5 of the sample, so it's a relatively small group. Then I have a group that's called stable job family norm, which is again, women who stay attached to the labor market, but unlike this group that tends to marry late, and sorry, I said earlier have children, this group tends to not have children. So this group has a long-term attachment to the labor market, but gets married at relatively normative ages and then have children and stays married throughout the observation period. And then we have, which is, this is the largest group, it represents 40%. And then a stable job family diverse group that is also women that tend to be attached to the labor market, but their family trajectories are kind of hard to classify. And this group is probably an artifact of the methodology I'm using, right? One could continue creating clusters from this, and most of those clusters are usually just this group getting separated into smaller groups. But they usually have family trajectories that are harder to classify, where women get divorced. A lot of women widow at some point during their trajectory, or they don't have children, or they're habitating, etc. So they tend to be sort of diverse family trajectories. And finally, we have a job flux family norm group that has like this group has a relatively easy family trajectory to classify, tends to marry a little bit later, but they fall under this, mostly under this other or unemployed category in their family trajectories. And unfortunately, I don't have really the information of what this other category means for this group. So that's why I just sort of, it's a job flux group that doesn't, it has a hard to classify employment trajectory. So with this, and I know this is a lot of information, but I want you to try to remember to a certain extent what this like names might mean. I try to give them descriptive names for the following part of the analysis. So this is a distribution of the trajectory types across countries and cohorts, and this is nothing particularly new, but basically we see that among newer cohorts, the trajectory type 2 homemaker archetype tends to be smaller and smaller and smaller, whereas the trajectory type number 4, which is a stable job family norm, tends to increase with among newer cohorts. And then we see some significant variance across countries, where we have sort of Southern European countries, the Netherlands and Ireland, as countries with a significant higher proportion of women following the homemaker archetype, whereas countries like the Czech Republic, is Germany, or Sweden and Denmark, for example, that have a significantly high proportion of women following the stable job family norm trajectory type. So the question, so all this was sort of to build the independent variable of the study. So what are the trajectory types, and how do they associate with mental health? So this is a regression analysis, sort of using the trajectory types as predictors. Just to give you a little details, the standard errors are clustered at the country cohort levels, and all models include country and year of interview fixed effects. And I include a series of sort of usual suspects as control. But what's interesting here to note in this sort of first model is that the entrepreneur families model, which was characterized by self-employed women following relatively traditional family trajectories, has a significantly is associated significantly with a reduction in depressive symptomatology, whereas the stable job family diverse group is associated with a higher depressive symptomatology. And all these models include cohort and age, but what's interesting here too is that defamiliation, which one would expect sort of to protect women, have a significantly positive effect. That means being exposed to higher levels of defamiliation throughout the life course associates with worse mental health for this woman. And the same with GDP per capita. So women exposed to higher levels of economic development tend to show higher levels of depressive symptomatology. So, sir.
A clarification question. These are all women who live inside the countries that are surveyed, irrespective of their immigration status or citizenship or whatever.
Yes, so fortunately, I am able to observe immigration patterns to some extent, not fully, because I don't know where this woman lived throughout their whole lives, but I know where they were born and where they live. And what I did for this study in particular, to sort of simplify things, is that I'm only looking at native-born women in their countries of origin. Yeah. So the sample is excluding women who might have migrated, which is a huge question, especially given that a big chunk of these women experienced World War II. So there were some also big migration patterns during that period. So before going into the moderation sort of effect or relationship of defamiliation policies over the relationship between life trajectories and mental health, I wanted to take a quick look at how an eventual change in what each trajectory means for each cohort, right? Because we know there are value changes across cohorts from sort of a culturalistic perspective. So I want to take a look at how what it means to follow each trajectory across cohorts might relate differently to mental health for each group. So this is just a figure showing average marginal effects of selected work family trajectory types over the probability of women reporting 3 or more depressive symptoms by birth cohort. And what we can see here is that the career risk late union group is associated negatively with depressive symptomatology across older cohorts, but it has a positive association among younger cohorts. So there's something going on in terms of changes on the meanings of what this trajectories mean in the cohorts. By meaning, it's like a very broad sense. It can be policy, it can mean anything, but there's something going on that makes this relationship flip across different cohorts. The entrepreneur panelist group that had, as we saw earlier, had a negative association. We can see that negative association is only true for newer cohorts, and something similar, but the opposite in the other way around happens for the stable job family diverse group. That was this group that's hard to classify in their family trajectories that increases depressive symptomatology, and only across younger or newer cohorts. So let's go to the moderation relationship between defamiliation policies and the trajectories, which was the main question that sort of inspired this research. And here we can see, and this is for me the most intriguing finding, that the career risk late union, so this is women who stayed working most of their lives, and they got married but didn't have children. Among women who were exposed to low levels of defamiliation, this trajectory type doesn't have an association with mental health. But among women who were exposed to high levels of defamiliation, this trajectory type increases depressive symptomatology. Oh, and I forgot to say, this is relative to the homemaker archetype. So relative to the homemaker archetype, women exposed to high levels of defamiliation who follow the career risk late union trajectory tend to show higher depressive symptomatology. And the opposite occurs with entrepreneur panelist group, where being exposed to higher levels of defamiliation decreases depressive symptomatology. And I think these are the most intriguing findings for two reasons. So if we look at the entrepreneur panelist group, one would expect for these policies to have an effect over women who are formally employed or who are dependent on an employer. But we see that higher levels of decriminalization decrease depressive symptomatology for women who are mostly self-employed during their lives, right? And that had traditional or normative families. And we see the opposite occurring for a group that had a strong long-term attachment, and they didn't have children, so one would expect for the defamiliarization policies to sort of have a null effect over this group, but then we see that there's an increase over the probability of experiencing depressive symptomatology. So, first of all, and just to conclude on this, I don't think I'll have much time to go into the other paper, but first of all, life trajectories matter, right? And this is not something new. There's plenty of research, sort of life course research, trying to understand how work-family dynamics matter for mental health. But what I try to show here that I think is relatively new is that there is a significant variance across cohorts, across different generations and societal changes in how that relationship plays out, right? So we know from previous literature that there are significant variations across cohorts in the way life courses sort of occur and are deployed, but this research also shows that there's a significant variation in terms of how the relationship between life course trajectories and mental health varies across cohorts and societal changes. One could also conclude here that defamiliarization policies significantly shape mental health. However, there is a big question mark here, which is how do they matter, right? So we know there's a complex relationship between defamiliarization policies and women's mental health, but we saw that there is a positive effect, positive numerically, negative substantively. The question is why? Why is it that defamiliarization policies, I mean, it could be because of confounding factors of not being able to observe here. It could be because, as we were talking earlier with Paula, because there are sort of unobserved cultural, or I don't want to say cultural, like attitudinal characteristics at the country level that sort of interact with defamiliarization policies that are creating a significant sort of level of stress over women, and that can be explained in that relationship. But we know it matters, and we need to better understand how it is that it matters. And we also can change, I mean, and this is sort of the whole purpose of the research agenda I'm trying to push. Institutional change occurs throughout people's life, and it must be measured. We cannot only sort of just assume that when we observe someone's health outcomes or labor force status or whatever it is at one point in time, that the institutional background they have, the institutions playing behind them are the ones we observed at that point in time, because institutions change. And I played with different ways of sort of trying to measure this. One could say, for example, that a good way of measuring change would not be just the arithmetic mean I used for the defamiliarization index, but also, I don't know, the standard deviation of that mean throughout one person's observation period. But really the measure didn't make a big difference. What we know is that higher levels of exposure matter for mental health. The question now that sort of remains open is, how do we measure this exposure at different points during a person's life course to actually make the point that institutional change matter throughout one person's life? And with that, I think it's really important to understand how future research sort of can understand how other factors like cultural, societal, and policy explanations might be interacting with this defamiliarization policies I'm trying to get at here. Because again, like doing this sort of macro level institutional research for health disparities always has the challenge of, okay, but like what other factors are going on at these countries, even though like my models use country year fixed effects, there are many things going on that could sort of relate to this. I think we need to better understand this relationship. So I'll use the 5 minutes I have just to briefly introduce the Latin American immigrants health paper, just to give you a sense of what the research design I'm working on with here. And all this to just close with my research agenda and final thoughts on this. So I had some cool animations. So this paper, what it tries to ask is, how does pre-migration institutional exposure among Latin American immigrants living in the US matter for their health status? And basically, what I'm trying to argue here is that most of this, sort of the approaches which I was just telling you about, would assume that people's life courses occur in one place, right? And we look at institutional change. But migrants' life courses in terms of place of residence, by definition, are way more complex, right? People move through different institutional arrangements. Therefore, we need to understand how those institutional arrangements matter for health. So this paper is, what it tries to do is sort of the first approach to saying, so it doesn't look at institutions in the US, but it looks at pre-migration institutions. So why? Because most research on migration just looks at institutional features in the country of destination, a lot of times forgetting about what those institutional features matter in the country of origin. So what I'm trying to say here, there is research sort of showing that there are significant variations across country of origin in terms of health, but we don't really know what it is about those countries of origin that matter for explaining that variation across different health outcomes. So in this paper, I explore exposure to varying levels of social spending on health and education, and the level of autocracy and democracy of the political regime. If someone's interested, I could go deeper into why this institutional features of Latin American countries. But I basically use a similar research design to the one before, and I measure these institutions when people were between ages 0 and 10 in 17 countries. And I just look, because of that, to people who migrated to the United States after age 10, and I look at the variations in their health status. So, just quickly for this, I use CPS data, which is not very good for this. It's not suited for this, but ideally, it's the only large enough data set that I know of. If someone knows of another one, please let me know. That includes country of birth, year of migration, and self-reported health status with a significant number of people within each country of origin, right? Most other data sets have countries with very few people, countries of origin with very few people that would not allow sort of during this kind of comparative analysis. So I look at people born outside the US between 1960 and 2009, again, who migrated at age 10 or older. And on the country level, I use Huber and Stiffin's data set on Latin American welfare states. And then the Polity 5 index, who maybe, if there are any political sociologists in the room, might be familiar with. And the analytical sample includes 17 countries. So I won't have time to go into this, but just wanted to briefly just this kind of the main results of the paper here, which basically shows that, so these are my 3 exposure variables of health spending. So the level of exposure to health spending in a country between ages 0 and 10, educational spending, and the level of exposure to autocracy, democracy, which I think is also a crucial variable when we look at the Latin American context, where people from Latin America have experienced within their own lives significant political changes through their lifetimes, right? So, and what I did here, it's interestingly show how these associations vary across the level of economic development of the country people lived through before they migrated. And the reason I do this, and someone convinced me of this argument, which I'm still thinking through, but it's basically the economic development sort of, it's a proxy for understanding sort of state of law and like how the country is able to efficiently spend the resources it's spending on these dimensions, et cetera. So interestingly, we see that health spending is negatively associated with self-reported health at low levels of economic development, but has a positive association with self-reported health at high levels of economic development. And also in educational spending, we see that there is no association up until the average level of GDP per capita, which is $6,800 in the period I observed. But it has a significant positive association at higher levels of economic development. And interestingly, the autocracy democracy variable has there's nothing interesting going on in terms of economic development, but it's significantly associated with better health across all models, the most conservative one, the least conservative one. So we can constantly see that people exposed to higher levels of democracy in their countries of origin experience a better health in their after they migrated. Oh, sorry, just very briefly. So I won't go into this whole conclusions, but one really important one for me is that I think this approach for studying migrants in the United States or wherever it is, the sort of so-called global north. So to go back a little bit, one of the reasons why we don't study countries of origin and their characteristics is because we usually don't have very good data and we don't know what immigrants did before they migrated, right? So I think this is a good window of opportunities to sort of put in context global north and global south research in the sense that we're looking at how people interacted with institutions in both contexts. So to be able to further develop this research agenda, the next step I want to take, and I'm working on a grant application right now to get some pilot data, but I want to sort of build retrospective data from Latin American immigrants in the United States, kind of like the one I used for the Share Life study, but be able to do it here in the US and be able to collect retrospective data to understand not only where people lived, but also during their lives, but also what their family trajectories look like, their employment trajectories look like, et cetera, et cetera. I know some people hate retrospective data, but with migrants, there's nothing else we can do that collect retrospective data, right? I mean, we cannot go to the 17 countries of origin, just like randomly assign people and follow people who might have a high propensity of like that would be extremely expensive. I would want to do it at a big level with several countries of origin. I know it's been done, but with like one observation. And finally, my other interest is applying this framework, and we're working on this with project with Linda Wade, collecting data, nationally representative data of older adults, LGBT older adults in the US. And once that same sample frame is built, which is still work in progress, I'm interested in also collecting retrospective data to understand how state level variation, but also variation across time, matters for LGBT individuals' health. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Now we're open for questions, comments.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. So I had a question. You talked a little bit about data limitations, and obviously, particularly within the US context, I think like following institutional and contextual exposures throughout the life course, we may not have the data for that. So could you talk a little bit about how you're thinking we can kind of like integrate or think about this framework when the data maybe doesn't allow for these types of in-depth analyses? Like how can we kind of integrate this thinking into our approaches or how we're thinking about our maybe cross-sectional work if that's all the data allows?
So I think one of the innovations I think of this approach is that it eventually allows you to, even if we have data, I mean, there are some really good longitudinal surveys in the US, right? And even if we have data that's not representative, let's say at the state level first, it's only representative at the national level, because the exposure indices are measured, they're built using state level or county level or whatever it is data, but they're measured at the individual level. I think sort of trying to sort of that shift of the focus from not only like what's going on the institutional level, but also like your individual level exposure, I think sort of allows doing that kind of analysis with data that's not necessarily representative at the state level, right? Especially because a lot of times for this kind of research, you're working with survey data, which again, is only representative at the national level. So you cannot do anything like multi-level analysis or whatever, but you can use, I mean, it has several limitations, but you can use place of birth and where people live. You're making strong assumptions where people live, right? And I know I'm like shooting myself on the feet. I don't know if that's in English, but because I'm like interested in studying migration, right? But I feel like that's the best we can do sometimes with the data we have. But ideally, what you want is to understand patterns of mobility people experience throughout their lives and able to build those exposure variables in a more accurate way. So that's why I'm a big fan of retrospective data, because it sort of allows you to get to that the nitty-gritty of that mobility throughout people's lives.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the institutional insights of the entrepreneurial women in your first paper. It seems like their institutional situation would be very peculiar compared to women in the workforce, especially for those birth cohorts. So do you have any hypotheses on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question because I'm a little biased here. So a lot of, as we talked earlier, a lot of the work I've done looking at this has been done in Chile. And Chile being self-employed has usually means being sort of outside the informal work, right? That's not necessarily the case in Europe. So I'm still trying to make sense of what the institutional implications are in terms of, I'm not fully sure yet, and I need to explore better the differences across countries, what it means to be self-employed in these different countries, right? It might be that there are differences across countries in terms of what it means, like Europe is not one unit, so those institutional differences might be playing out. Also, going deeper, I think I'm currently revising these papers. I've been reading a lot on this. Going deeper, I think it's also interesting to better understand how these policies play out for self-employed women. And that's something I don't have an answer for right now. But I think it's really interesting, especially because the meaning of what it is to be self-employed is not the same in Europe relative to Latin America, for example, right? But yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you are able to also measure the mental health asset trajectory, because I was thinking you're using the share data and you have the way before and after.
Yeah, I can do that. Not for the whole life, but like for the periods of observation of share, because like share life observes sort of trajectories of different dimensions, but not health in particular. I think there's a very broad variable of like health status, but if you map it, most people report throughout their whole life being relatively healthy, or like there's no much variation across life. But what one could do is sort of look at assuming this, and there's also an assumption, assuming this trajectories end at age 50, right? Because they continue. The problem is that you lose a big sample if you keep sort of moving the age later on, and then sort of look at mental health trajectories after the trajectories in employment and health, right? But if it's for like the defamiliation purposes, for example, like if we're looking at mental health later in life, I don't know how we could sort of think through the decriminalization policies, which no longer make this woman eligible, right, matter for their mental health later in life. So it would still need to be sort of a research design where you're looking at life trajectories in one point, like in one stage of life, and then the mental health outcomes in another stage of life. But yeah, one could do that to sort of look at what the sort of intercept and slope of those trajectories is across different groups. And so we do have a really interesting paper using HRS data that uses exactly that research design.
Very interesting. Do you have information about the partners for the women's analysis? It's like I guess I want to ask you, is there some sort of tension between female independence and happiness or depression? There is this finding out there that in dual learner couples, men are happy and women are stressed out.
Yeah.
And so
that's a really good question. And I'm pretty sure, so like HRS interviews partners. I'm pretty sure Share does too. If someone knows, I'm pretty sure it does. And I think it would be interesting to sort of look at how those life trajectories co-occur, and they might create conflict. I cannot measure conflict directly, but one could hypothesize that certain co-occurring trajectories create conflict among different sex couples that might reflect into mental health. So yeah.
I was actually thinking about the stress of being the primary breadwinner. Okay, if women the entrepreneurial independent women are making more than their spouses, then they assume the stress of
Yeah.
family life and things like that, where, so that, like,
Yeah.
female independence comes with stress.
Mhm.
And so I wonder there's a connection there.
Yeah, that's a really good, but yeah,
Yeah.
you have a really good idea. Sorry.
I wanted to ask a few different questions. Picking up on the last two, one has to do with the fact that you're measuring your outcomes or when people are over 50. And I'm thinking of all of the policies that you're discussing are kind of work-family policies that are designed to handle, challenges of life that people have mostly when they have small kids, but to some extent when they have elder care issues. So I'm wondering, I'm just trying to wrap my head around why should there be any effect for people in their 50s? Because the policies are not kind of designed to that. The second question has to do with the statistical power that you have. So you have a huge sample, you have lots of data points for each individual. But if you think about this as kind of a multi-level situation, you really have 16 data points.
Yes.
We have 16 countries. And so we got this index, and just the last question is, and so, how do we, all those debates about Eustace Anderson's models, they've got these configurations but you got, 15 countries, 20 countries max, 12 countries in a lot of studies. So you got this small n problem when you're trying to figure out which exact policies really make the most difference. And apropos that, I have two real quick points. One has to do with when I hear this argument that says, defamilialization policies increase stress, my first reaction is, well, they didn't go far enough to really handle work-family challenges. We need to do a whole lot more. And so, yes, there are lots of working women with kids who, find themselves in stressful situations. It's not the policy's fault. It's just, husbands aren't doing enough housework, and maybe we need to go farther in reorganizing the workplace.
So to your first question, so what I'm actually doing is that I'm measuring the life trajectories between ages 15 and 50, and I'm also measuring the defamiliation exposure between ages 15 and 50. So I'm not looking at defamiliation policies at the time of observation, I'm looking at defamiliation policies before and how they interact with the life courses. So from a cumulative sort of disadvantage perspective, the life courses themselves, one would expect that the way they unfold to have certain effect over mental health. But then the question is how the defamiliation policies that were occurring while this life courses sort of unfolded matter for mental health later
In the 50s.
Exactly, yes, because from a cumulative sort of disadvantage perspective, what happened before early in life, and when we know that there's sort of from the literature, there's a huge association between what happened before in your life, what happens later in life in terms of your health. So those cumulative effects is what I'm trying to get at with mental health. And to your second question, what I'm also trying to do here, yes, that the N is small, but at the same time, because I'm looking at exposure indices, the N is not really the number of countries, but the number of country cohorts, right? So, so just by using that research design, the N increases. But if anything, that association would be conservative, given the statistical power we have at the sort of country cohort level, right? But yeah, I mean, it's an issue for all sort of institutional life course health research. But I think this approach which creates the N at the country level, not just the country, but the country cohort or country year level. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, last question, yes, right?
So I have worked with this data, so you may want to look at apropos the question, at the actual age of the women, because Cher interviews the household head, so to speak, and the head has to be 50 or older, but not the partners or their spouses. So you may have even younger women than 50 in your data.
So because of the way I designed the study, the women had to be at least 50 years old, so I could observe their whole trajectory between age 15 and 50. So there is sort of, and one could discuss like what that implicates for the representativeness of the sample, but women are limited to 50 and older. And at the same time, like one of the problems is that I'm observing women of different ages, right? But I try to sort of play with the statistical tools to control for that, given that I have information about age cohort, et cetera.
And the other thing is, I wonder if you can play with, by grouping countries together or find some kind of better control. Because countries like the Scandinavian countries have such generous welfare states. And I'm very surprised about your results for women who are in these countries, because you shouldn't be finding this strong mental health effects. On the other hand, countries like Greece, have no welfare and no safety net. So you would expect to find that. So I don't know if you're able to group, like Scandinavians together and maybe Germany and the Netherlands and France together and something like that.
Yeah, I mean, one
To see.
could do that, but I think it sort of misses, eventually doing that misses the whole point of saying there's institutional change occurring in these countries. And also the models I'm using, because I'm using country of origin, country mix effects, basically I'm modeling the within country variation in terms of decriminalization policies. So that's why I was also very surprised by that association with decriminalization. And that's why I'm not fully convinced it's only decriminalization. There has to be something else going on that is sort of interacting with this that explains the result.
Okay, we're out of time. Okay, thank you.